Delightful introduction. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I do indeed focus a lot on the kind of how research is done, how we can do it more effectively. This is a diversion from that. This is me having spent about a year as a quantitative researcher trapped in the body of a qualitative researcher who didn't really want to be there by the end of it. So if you get the title of this paper, if you scan a QR code, is I just wanted to get it over and done with. And I think it was Freudian because I didn't intend it as I was naming the paper, but it's an accurate reflection of both what we're going to talk about in how players experience games, but also how I felt about the paper by the time it was done. So, down is forward, got it. We have, there's a theory of self-determination theory that's quite prominently used in player experience research, understanding how players are motivated by games, how players are affected by games. In my opinion, it's one of the better theories out there in terms of how well it's validated, how falsifiable it is, how iterative it's been. It's been one of the better theories in terms of not just someone puts this thing forward in the 70s and then it remains static, but actually trying to figure out where is it working well, where is it working less well, and then building upon that. So in a world where psychological theory is in a bit of a crisis, the term theory crisis gets thrown around, I think this is one of the better ones. And one of its key tenets is these three things called basic psychological needs. And it says that everyone has basic and intrinsic universal needs, no matter who you are, for autonomy. So it's the needs to feel a sense of kind of control and volition in your life. And if you have the opposite of that, if your autonomy is thwarted, you might be feeling coerced or controlled. You have a need to feel competent, a sense of kind of growth and mastery and effectiveness in what you do. And if that is thwarted, you might be experiencing feelings of failure and self-doubt. And you have basic needs, basic need for relatedness, to feel connected to and caring and cared for by others. And if that is undermined, you might feel feelings of loneliness and exclusion. So we have these needs that can be satisfied or they can be frustrated. And the satisfaction of them has been kind of the main focus for games research to date. We think of games as these generally motivating things, and you know, the reason that they are motivating is because they tend to satisfy needs very well. And we have lots of evidence to show that. But we also have pretty good reason to think that they might sometimes frustrate needs, and it's not super clear yet how that happens and then what kind of outcomes or consequences that might have when it does. So when need frustration occurs in daily life, this is something that you can apply, you know, in the context of games, but also to your life as a whole, what you're experiencing at work, what you're experiencing with your friends and family. People who are experiencing need frustration also tend to report higher ill-being. They might be more depressed. They're likely to burn out. Poor physical health is involved there. All kinds of different psychopathology or mental health conditions are associated with need frustration. So there's good reason to believe that this is an important predictor of kind of overall functioning of a person. For games specifically, it might help explain some of their negative impacts for when people are not enjoying a game that they're playing, when they decide to quit or churn or disengage with a game. And some of the adverse impacts of media use, things like addiction, things like aggression that do get thrown around as potential negative outcomes of different media. And then importantly, like I just mentioned, to date it's a little bit empirically empty in this context. That's we have this kind of top-down theoretical definition of what we think need frustration is and how it operates, and good evidence for the fact that this is an important thing for your life as a whole. We have kind of anecdotal evidence to suggest that it's relevant to gaming, and you know, a handful of papers that have started to probe that, but that's about it. But almost no kind of naturalistic description of what is happening when people are experiencing need frustration, what gaming experiences are need frustrating, and then what effects does that have for people. So we tried to address this. We did some semi-structured interviews and took a constructivist grounded theory analysis. This, like I said, this broke me. This took me a year. Anyone who's done, some of the other students who were doing 20 interviews or something like that, I truly cannot imagine. This was brutal. So many times that I've read the same transcripts, I cannot describe it to you. And I think it's important because if Tom's probably in the audience somewhere, if he is, there he is, yes. This is a well-founded approach and used in lots of previous research of taking categories from an existing theory where they are underdeveloped, where they are empirically empty, and then generating data about those to develop sort of a grounded theory of how that underdeveloped part of the theory is working. And crucial, of course, is remaining open to challenging those theories, discarding them if they're not relevant. If we find that people don't actually report any frustrating experiences, then we would have gotten rid of those categories. Spoiler, that's not what we found. But Tom, please check the method section for references on justification to this approach. And here's the big overview of what we found. Here's the model that we came up with. So we have in the box, it's a little bit circular, so it's kind of hard to pick an entry point. But we have these different types of need frustrating experiences, these categories of need frustrating experiences. We ended up with 3 for each of the needs, and I'll go through those one by one in a second. But I think probably the crucial thing that is important to note here is that need frustration didn't occur because of a particular event in the game. It occurred because of a particular event in the game relative to what players were expecting. So we found that people who were anticipating that in this upcoming section of the game, I might lack a little bit of control and volition. This is an escort quest. I have some kind of previous understanding of what an escort quest is like. I therefore kind of set an expectation that yes, this upcoming section might be a little autonomy frustrating, but that's okay. And then I don't have that kind of negative affective reaction to that experience because it's in line, more or less in line with what I was expecting. And that was true for all 3 needs. Instead, need frustration occurred when that situation was more salient or more intense than what people were expecting. And over time, when people were experiencing more and more need frustration or more and more need frustrating situations, that would then update their expectations for future experiences. And that, crucially, those expectations were what were driving people's play behavior. They were sitting down and thinking, based on what I experienced last time I played this game, or based on what I experienced last time I played similar games, what do I think I'm going to get out of this game or this gaming session? If that's not, if that's not need satisfying, if that's a negative experience, then I don't play. And if it is, then I do, of course. And that sounds intuitive. I think you can all probably recognize that in your own play. But it's not necessarily well represented in the literature. We think of it a little bit more as kind of stimulus reaction. That's people have a negative experience and they react to it. And that's not necessarily how our participants were describing it. They would kind of go through a session, have that negative experience, not necessarily think too much about it or be so affected by it in the moment, but then the next time they went to pick up a game, they were thinking, oh yeah, that last time I played, that wasn't that fun. Maybe this current time won't be as fun either. And then that last thing on the bottom that has, for some reason, lost its color, maybe it was gray originally, are extra things, the kind of incentives to play a game that are separate from the enjoyment of playing it itself that can motivate people to play despite expecting need frustration. They might know that they're going into a need frustrating situation, but say they think that a couple hours down the line, once they get out of this frustrating segment of the game, it might be motivating and fun again, or because they feel a sense of obligation that's kind of core to their identity, that they play this game, that they play all the Final Fantasy games, or all the Assassin's Creed games, and they persist through need frustrating situations. So that's in there to demonstrate that it's not just this feedback loop that affects how people play games. There are other reasons besides the inherent enjoyment of playing that can impact what people's behavior. So I will go through some examples of these, and the very nature of a grounded theory is that it's almost so exhaustive that it would be pretty difficult to cover in a 15-minute talk. So I will kind of highlight on a few interesting examples from each area. But in terms of autonomy frustration, people described 3 types. They described feeling that their desired playstyle was constrained. So we got examples of people who wanted to play a particular character. Say you're in a draft mode and you want to play the DPS, but of course those are the most popular, and the 3 people before you picked DPS. Now suddenly you have to play a healer, and you're committed. You at this point you're committed to the next 20 or 40 minutes of playing, not in the way that you want to, but in a way that the game or the situation is kind of forcing you to play. We had people whose ability to play in the first place was constrained, so these experiences need not necessarily be in the game itself, but they're around people's gaming and how they're interacting with games. If you want to play a game and you can't because your schedule doesn't allow you to, that can also be a quite autonomy frustrating experience. And there are people who feel at certain times compelled to play. Say you bought a battle pass and you really want to get the maximum value out of that battle pass, but at the moment you're actually not really feeling like playing. The same thing's true for daily quests, of course. That people would describe, playing to get those rewards, playing because they felt like the game was making them or compelling them to, even though they didn't necessarily want to be doing it at the time. So one of the quotes from the desired playstyles is they talked about in the Assassin's Creed game, you're pulled out of the animus, it's by force, and they sort of force you to do a few sort of mundane actions in the real world I'm just like, why are you making me do this? I don't want to do this. Can I just go back into Animus, please? That's why I'm interested. And that kind of also highlights some of the extrinsic motivations that I was talking about before, that they're not enjoying this segment. They know that they're not enjoying this segment, but they are expecting that they will enjoy a future segment, and that's enough for them to persist through this, at least if it's in the right dose. If I imagine for this player, if the Animus segments got too ballooned in size, that would be the kind of thing that would then cause them to turn. For competence, we had feelings of stagnation, feeling that people, that your ability to grow and improve was limited. People weren't feeling any kind of change in their performance or ability to get better at the game or learn more about it or how it works. We had people describing unfair situations where they are expecting some kind of ability to compete on a certain playing field and were not able to. We had examples from people who felt they were being matched against unfair opponents, that the matchmaking system wasn't good enough. We had people saying, linking in nicely with Marco's talk and a few others about AI agents that were that were playing with unfair rules, but that wasn't transparent. And Dan as well, sorry, thank you. And then we had people who were experiencing meaningless actions, where the game kind of gave you a set of decisions to make or choices or actions that you could take, and none of those had the desired impact or perhaps any impact that the player was looking for. An example, the first one, a player said, I can play this game, I know how to play it, but for whatever reason, every time I go into it, I can barely get a kill. And I'm just constantly, lowest on the leaderboard. In those moments, I do feel frustrated at myself and a little frustrated at the game because I'm like, I can do this. Why can't I do it now? And so again, these don't have to be persistent necessarily. They can be temporary and fleeting. But the longer they last, the more intense they're felt, the more likely that it's going to lead to a behavioral change and the likelihood of that person picking up the game in a future setting. And then lastly, for relatedness, we had people talking about being disconnected from other players. One of the most obvious examples of this, of course, is being harassed or trolled by others. We had people feeling kind of disconnected from the community at large, that the community wasn't a place where they felt welcome or wasn't a place that they felt able to participate. And then we had people who were feeling disconnected from the characters or world. And this is one that I think is really interesting, that's been kind of also underappreciated in at least the self-determination theory literature so far, that people, of course, we know that I think almost all of us have experienced it, feel a connection to characters, feel a connection to that world and that setting, but at the same time, the opposite can be true. It can be a setting where you don't feel at all welcome, or you don't feel at home, or characters that are making strange decisions that kind of alienate you from them. One of the funny ones that a participant gave that isn't on here but is in the paper was from one of the Tomb Raider games where oh goodness, and I'm gonna butcher this because I haven't played any of them. But Lara Croft was essentially pressing a button that's to the player was immediately obvious that this was going to cause some doomsday-like event. Like, it was super clear, and she's sitting there yelling, like, "Why are you pressing the button? Don't press the button. You've raided so many tombs. What are you thinking?" And that's to her that was an experience of pretty deep alienation from why this character doesn't make sense. It's not somebody that I necessarily want to be. And so from disconnect from other players, it's a classic example. As soon as anyone finds out that you're a female gamer in Call of Duty this person was playing, sort of immediately preconceived jokes, and it makes it hard to feel included, even on your own team, in those scenarios. And that was enough for this player to definitely scale back her engagements with Call of Duty as a result. And just to highlight, I think the expectations part I've described at a higher level, but just to give a couple examples of how players were describing this kind of expectation-driven behavior loop. This is an example of kind of where expectations were undermined, where people had a positive or neutral expectation, and the game subverted that in their perception. Where a character in Cyberpunk 2077 felt like he only died to advance the plot, and not even in a very meaningful way. And when I kind of probed whether he had that experience in different games, where a character had died only to advance the plots. And he said yes, but it was about his perception that the game design had signaled that there was an ability to alter this outcome, whereas in a different game, Red Dead Redemption 2, there isn't that false promise of, okay, yes, supposedly I decide the story, but really we're just going to do whatever the developer wants to do. So the expectations that people come in with can be based on their previous experiences with that game, games in that series, with other games in that genre, but also, of course, signals from the game design itself about what you have control over and what you maybe don't. And on the other hand, this is an example of a player very clearly, cogently describing how their expectations affected their future decision making. If I found that 2-hour process of beating a boss in Elden Ring frustrating, and I really didn't enjoy it, then I'll be thinking, well, he was describing the next time that he was going to pick up a game. I'll be thinking, well, I played this one and I don't have to feel like I was beaten by it. He got over the obstacle, but do I want more of that? And sometimes the answer is no, or at least other games are more motivating. So, there's more to cover. I highly, and I'm plugging the paper, of course. It's just a preprint for it at the moment, but please do check it out because there's more to dive into that I don't have time for. But what are the kind of high-level takeaways from this? For me, at the most basic level, need frustration is really common and has important impacts on player experience and behavior. Every player that I described for every need that I described very quickly came up with an example of when they felt a sense of need frustration in games, and often, had more than I could even take down in the amount of time that we had. The current measures that we use, which are kind of adapted from other domains or ad hoc little modifications to existing measures, some of them don't measure need frustration at all, and the ones that do measure it fairly poorly. They're not very well validated, and they certainly don't capture the kind of diversity of experiences that we found here. So that's kind of another testament to the empirically empty aspect bit, that it's applying these top-down notions, but they're not really fully applicable to this domain, and they might be missing some of these important experiences that we found here. Oh, that's the wrong button. And then lastly, this is kind of opens up a whole research direction that's I think is fascinating and that I certainly do not have time for in the near future. But I really think that kind of expectation-driven account of behavior rather than the kind of stimulus-reaction bit is super interesting. This connects really nicely with a huge trend in the cognitive sciences, the predictive processing model, which is this kind of series of infinitely scaling Bayesian models of people, your brain constantly trying to generate predictions about the world, and motivation and positive experience come from the reduction of prediction error. So you're looking for ways in the world to kind of match your expectations and your predictions about what is going to happen with what actually happens, and it's really satisfying to reduce those. And this aligns super, super nicely with the kind of expectation-driven model that we have here. So some of the next steps to keep an eye out for if you're follow me on Twitter or something. This will be turned into a questionnaire in the near future. There are, of course, a handful of need satisfaction-based questionnaires for games, none that measure need frustration, or at least measure it well. And indeed, there are also some problems with the existing measures, even separate from their lack of need frustration coverage. So that's one of the crucial next steps. Once we have a questionnaire like that, then we get to do the kind of aggregate level population-wide, are these experiences of need frustration related to behavioral outcomes in a quantitative way? Is it related to disengagement? Is it related to churn? And that starts to get closer to kind of actionable insights for designers and developers. This is kind of a little bit of a limitation of the current paper, that our players mostly talked about console and PC games. We don't think that anything is likely to change the kind of core need frustration expectation behavior model, but I do suspect that some, due to the sample of gamers and the games that they were playing in our sample, there might be other categories of need frustration that we haven't yet identified. Things related to monetization in mobile games, I think, are a particular area of potential expansion. And then, of course, there's the whole work of kind of translation and making this more actionable for people. That's it for me now. I'm happy to take as many questions as I can for roughly the next 5 minutes, but I unfortunately have to dash shortly after this meeting. So if you want to chat more in more depth, please do find me on Twitter or email or wherever else on the internet, and I'd be happy to chat more.